Hello, I am Commissioner Emma I. Darnell. Welcome to the Mighty Five Conversations. As you know, Conversation is a monthly information and communication program focusing on the sustainable community, economically strong, environmentally safe, with liberty and justice for all. The topic for today's conversation is another look at neighborhood revitalization. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll be back in a moment. Joining me in the conversation today is Michael Dobbins. Mr. Dobbins is a professor of the practice of planning at the Georgia Tech College of Architecture. Mr. Dobbins holds a bachelor's and master's degree from Yale University and formerly served as Commissioner of Planning and Community Development for the City of Atlanta. Welcome, Mr. Dobbins.
Very happy to be here.
We are very pleased to have you here and to have an opportunity to talk with you once again about ideas coming out of that Georgia Tech graduate school program which you operate. We're very interested here, as you may know, in the whole problem of joblessness in this county. And we've tried many things. Some have worked pretty well, some haven't worked so much. And this public-private partnership approach is one we're very interested in. But we've heard something recently about something your students have been working on that we hadn't heard before. And I want to talk to you about that today because, as you know, because you know how it is out here, folks want jobs, Mr. Dobbins, don't they?
They absolutely do.
People want to work.
They want to work. That's the core of neighborhood revitalization. If people can work, they can afford to live, they can afford to have groceries, they can afford daycare, they can...
Preventive health, everything.
That's right.
It just reduces the cost of government because it reduces poverty.
That's correct.
Yes. Tell us what you're all working on over there. It's really exciting.
Well, I think it's really exciting too.
Yes.
My students and I are working this semester on basically about a mile radius around the new Falcon Stadium project. And the title of the studio is Connectivity. And the reason we came to that is because there are lots of different studies that have gone on in English Avenue and Vine City and the choice neighborhoods
studies.
and the promised neighborhoods and the
Yes.
Downtown Development Technical Advisory Group and the Multimodal Pasture Terminal Facility and the Falcons. And none of them seem to be looking at each other. So what we're trying to do is several things. One thing is the traditional cultural divide that Northside Drive represents, if it isn't handled right with the new stadium, will only become a longer, deeper divide, a blank wall. So we're really anxious to break down the east-west divide that Northside Drive has represented. An example of that is Magnolia Street from Vine City ought to feed right into Andrew Young International Boulevard so that
Makes
people can
sense.
flow back and forth between
Yes.
Vine City and Centennial Olympic Park and downtown.
Yes.
But I think the jobs focus came out of some experiences that we researched, the students and I, and the idea there is technically a requirement for a community benefit agreement to be approved by the city council before they actually commit finally to allow the $200 million of public money, followed by another several $100 million off into the future. That agreement, and we've talked about different forms of the agreement, but first and foremost is how do you get what I think the Falcons' good intentions are about hiring people, how does that go from good intentions to a binding agreement where you actually set up provisions, how many jobs, of what kind of training should be provided, and the basis of all this is a $1.2 billion project.
And it seems to me that what the principles that you're setting out, though, would be applicable not only to this particular project, but to governments like ours who have the same interests, and that is in eliminating unemployment and increasing opportunities for jobs.
Absolutely.
So it applies to not just this project, but it seems to me would apply to any government or agency that wanted to see results rather than just rhetoric in this area.
I think that's absolutely right, and the role of government is twofold. One is funding,
Yes.
without which these projects can't go forward,
Yes.
and the other is approvals, because there are a number of approvals for street relocation
Good point.
and zoning and all
You can't
kind of
do it
stuff.
without government.
Can't do it without government. So I think the key is to, and you know, when I was at the city, we made our best effort to get agreements written down so that projects that came along
Have to be in writing, don't they?
have to be in writing, because people will tell you what sounds good, but if they don't agree to it, and if they don't stipulate, okay, we're going to hire X number of people, we're going to hire, some of those people are going to be people who've been long-term unemployed, we're going to provide for the training. One way to think about it is, instead of asking the company what kind of jobs they need, is to ask the people what kind of jobs can they do.
I thought that was an interesting idea. I really had never heard that before.
Well, it's
And that is, you develop the jobs from what the people's skills are and move them up if it's necessary.
That's
but
right.
you go to where their skills are.
No, I think that's critical. And one way to think about it is a ladder. And you know, if you can get on the first rung,
Then
and
you
you
can
can
go
go to the
up.
second rung.
Yes.
But right now we have a lot of broken runs down at the bottom where there's nothing to even grab onto. But people have capabilities. You know, people aren't dumb to begin
And they
with.
have capabilities we need.
That's right. And that the job needs. We
Yeah,
have in the
construction
Vine
and
City English Avenue
non-construction.
neighborhoods, we have storm drainage issues that can be
That's
solved. We have
right.
park development issues.
Yes.
We have demolition and maintenance issues. And the stadium also has those kind of issues. So why
Interesting.
it doesn't seem to be such a stretch to say, okay, City Council, if you're going to approve this, here is an agreement that stipulates how many jobs and when the Falcons will produce, and not just the job, but the chain of jobs, the pipeline. And the Falcons have said some good things about this. Now, they've said them. Now the question would be, will they actually agree in writing to stipulate numbers of jobs, you know, goals? Maybe
Well,
you don't reach the goals, but
yes.
at least if you set a goal
You
and
have
you
to
have
have
it in
that
writing, you have
yes.
to. You
It's
have
a
to,
plan, isn't it?
That's right. Every quarter you've got to say
Yes.
how well you did. Well, why didn't you do better? And is there anything we can do together to make that work?
Have we done anything like this?
Well,
before?
in-
What about that First Source program?
Well,
It's voluntary for one thing, and
It's voluntary. It's a step forward. I mean, the way trying to level the playing field between developer and community is to take small steps. But at least if the steps
Good
are going
point.
forward instead of backward, you're getting somewhere. So
well,
First
we have
Source,
that First Source program, and I said I was going to ask you about that today. Is that going in the right direction? Because it is necessary that commitments are made in writing,
right.
and there is a specific number of entry-level jobs that
Right.
are that the contractor must submit to. But that's a kind of public-private partnership, but it's not exactly what we're talking about here. But maybe, as you said, we can build on that.
Well, I think it's taking the next step. And the next step
I
begins
like
to
that ladder concept.
Yeah, it stipulates a number of jobs and the types of jobs. And there are a lot of different types of jobs associated with a construction project and the operation of the stadium.
We
when
know
it's done.
that.
Now, we do have an interesting precedent that our research discovered, that when the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, which was responsible for building all of the Olympic event venues in the city and beyond, there were a couple of people whose names you might recognize. The president of the Atlanta Planning Advisory Board, which is where all the neighborhood planning units come together, was a man named Vincent Fort. You may have heard of him.
I believe I have.
And the person who was then in charge of the AFL-CIO, the labor union umbrella group, was a man named Stuart Acuff.
Oh, yeah.
And the two of them together were able to use community pressure, community organizing, to oblige the ACOG, the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, to hire 250 community people, 100 of whom were unemployed for one reason or another. One of the problems with First Source is contractors will hold a job fair, And one time people show up, and then they'll basically say, well, you're not qualified, you're not qualified, you're not qualified, you're not qualified. That's why I think it's important to say, instead of you're not qualified for what we want you to do, the question should be, what can you do that we can use?
I like that.
And that takes a shift in mind, but it's one that starts balancing, leveling the playing field a little bit. So we want to take that next step. So the students and I have been recommending these kinds of moves to the Community Benefit Agreement Committee, along with public safety improvements and housing improvements and transportation connectivity improvements. So I'm really proud of the work that the students have done so far.
Well, they've
it's
done
comprehensive.
excellent work.
When I teach, the main thing I teach my students is to listen. And that means going out in the community and trying to listen and trying to incorporate what they're hearing in terms of priorities and values and goals, and then use whatever technical skills they picked up to try to match the priorities and needs that people have in the neighborhoods. And they're different. It isn't just English Avenue, Vine City, it's Castleberry Hill, it's even downtown. Because downtown isn't particularly well connected to this whole Falcon Stadium design idea.
Well, both of these concepts clearly demonstrate that you've been listening.
I hope so.
Because that's what we hear. Our people don't like to be separated. Yes, people don't like to be separated. People like jobs. You know, people like to feel that they have priority since they're paying taxes and live here.
That's right.
And so it's clear that you've been listening. But how do you respond, Mr. Dobbins, when folks say, we'll never be able to really move folks up that ladder because they are handicapped in the beginning by poor schools, by social and economic factors over which government has no control? How do you respond to that?
Well, you may recall about 2 months ago there was a study that came out that was published by a group at Harvard and a group at the University of California, Berkeley. And what that study showed, and it sort of measured the ability for people in lower income categories, their ability to move up the ladder. And Atlanta scored last of all the cities in the U.S. In other words, we have less mobility. I think the number was only 4% of our children growing up in the bottom 20% of incomes had any chance of escaping being in the bottom 20%.
I saw that. I want to talk to you about that and the whole problem of income inequality. We rank very high.
Yes, and the Gini,
on that
that's
scale.
another index.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. When we come back, we've got to take a break.
Oh,
right
okay,
now.
we'll do that.
We'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. Mr. Dobbins, you were telling us about this Gini index that evaluated the nation's cities with respect to this whole problem of income inequality.
Yes.
Tell us a little more about that.
That study established that among the larger cities in the United States, Atlanta showed the largest gap between rich and poor.
The largest gap.
Right. So, you know, and then we were talking before about that other study that talked about how difficult it was for anybody in the lower income quintile, they call it bottom 20%, to be able to progress to the next stage. And the importance of, okay, we've got a serious problem. We have a leadership structure who for decades has tended to ignore this problem. We have a swath of neighborhood planning units where incomes are low, median family incomes are below $30,000 per year, and without jobs and without economic hope, and then we can't close that gap. We talked before about how we get people on a ladder. How do we build that lowest rung? And Representative Henry B. Gonzalez back in the day used to say that I want to put the jars of fruit and cereal on the low shelves where the little people can reach them. And that's sort of a starting point for how you imagine how to create an environment, a work environment, a decent living environment, streets that have lights on them, sidewalks that aren't broken,
wheelchair
ramps,
that are not boarded up.
houses that are not boarded up, schools that function well. And you can't really, as you've pointed out, the government can't do all of that. The real resources that build communities tend to be private resources. Even government projects are designed by private consultants and built by private contractors. Has to be a partnership. And if we want to become a leader in overcoming this disparity between rich and poor, but between the inability for low-income people to have a chance to get on the rungs of job improvement, then we really have to have concerted effort on the part of the business community, the political community. And the only way to do that is to stipulate some very specific goals that we're going to try to achieve with respect to jobs, with respect to housing improvement. And it isn't really a linear thing where you start with one. You start on all fronts. I've heard a lot of people say, well, we have to fix the education system first. Well, we don't have to fix it first. We have to fix it. But we have to fix it in conjunction with giving people who are able-bodied the opportunity and the right to work and make some kind of wage and some kind of improvement. In the course of that, they will improve their educational level.
But isn't it also true, though, that government really has the capability in some areas better than it does in others? That
Yes.
is, you know, in terms of the factors that actually affect mobility.
That's absolutely true. Government can't do it all. What government does have within its grasp, and in this case, the case of the Falcons, the Atlanta City Council, in the case of the multimodal passenger terminal facility, another $1 billion project, both state government and city government are involved in that. The approval power, not for money on the one hand, and just giving permits on the other, pretty strong levers that the government can apply to a private development project. When I was at the city, as an example, we were able to work with the community, Northwest Community Alliance, you're probably familiar with them,
I am.
to create the first underground Walmart in the world up at Howell Mill Road.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's District 5.
That's District 5.
Yes.
And we worked, I was at the city, we had a few levers and city approvals, not even so much, we didn't have any funding for that project, but we had zoning and road improvement levers that we were able to bring to bear with the Community Alliance to result in a shopping square above, a parking lot above a Walmart down the basement. And that's an example of a community benefit that showed a balancing of community interests with private sector interests and government's ability to approve.
Well, we know all these initiatives clearly require political will.
Yes, indeed.
But what are some other factors that are necessary in order to do a project like the project you did with ACOG when the Olympics were here, and also I believe the London Olympics? They had the very same approach that you're talking about now.
Yes.
We know political will is crucial. But in addition to that, what are some of the other factors that affect and that led to the success of this approach?
Well, one slight correction, I wasn't actually here when the ACOG deal was created. I was the happy beneficiary when I got here before the Olympics, but after that work was essentially done. The London situation is very much like the situation we deal with the Falcons and the multimodal station, a mega project landing in an essentially low-wealth community with a lot of needs, low income, low education attainment, no access to jobs. And in London, they call them boroughs instead of council districts. So the 6 boroughs that were among the poorest in the whole city of London, bigger city than we are, were able to come together and agree with the London equivalent of the ACOG group that there would be some jobs structured in return for approving that project for going forward. And they set goals, and they actually met goals.
And the communities involved came together?
Yes, and that's absolutely fundamental. Yeah, and that's the hard part. It's how, within any given...
Well, harder than in government. We
true.
struggle to come together too, but those communities came together.
They came together,
London.
And I'm not sure all the elected officials in those London boroughs were so excited about these ideas to begin with, but they heard from their constituents, they listened to their constituents, and they negotiated.
Give them credit for that.
And they get credit for that, and they actually put it forward as an agreement setting goals, how many people from the community, how many long-term unemployed, how many local businesses will get jobs. And point that you made earlier, how many of people who need jobs will be hired by those smaller disadvantaged business owners or major contractors.
It must have been extraordinary cooperation, though, from the business community.
It was both cooperation and somewhat obliged cooperation, because the
It was in their
businesses-
best interest.
in their best interests, and they needed approvals.
And that's what the whole public-private partnership concept is based on.
That's
that
what it
we
should be
have,
based on.
But it should be based on
Yeah,
that we
I-
have mutual goals and mutual. Well, we have separate interests because the public interest is not the same as the profit-making interest.
Right.
But we certainly have mutual goals, and we come together to meet our mutual goals, which is to business to complete the project and make money, and government to act in the best interest of people. In this case, people who are jobless.
Right, and impacted by this new development.
Yes.
I think there are two sides to a community benefit agreement. One is the developer agrees to hire some number of people and help them get the necessary training to qualify, agrees to hire them for a length of time as long as they don't mess up. But the community agrees to support the project. So it's a two-sided deal.
That's an important point.
And in the case
you
of
got to have agreement on both sides.
That's right. And the community agreement has a significant role when it comes to government over how fast the zoning gets approved, how fast the street realignment gets approved.
That's very important.
Because the community has the ability to essentially, through their elected officials, stall a development for a period of time. And time is money in any development project. So that if the developer meets right away up front with the community, says, what would you like me? I want to do this project. It's a new investment in the community. I know it'll have some impacts. I want to make those positive. What kinds of things can the community do for my project to make this happen?
Well, this is just really, really exciting. I knew this wasn't going to be enough time for us to talk about it, Mr. Dobbins, but what I hear in your description of how this really worked in London and how it should work here, the word that comes to my mind is commitment. We have to be serious about getting it done.
Yes.
The government has to be serious about really dealing with joblessness. Business has to be very serious about listening to the community and making a real commitment to do it.
Right.
And then the community has to be serious.
That's right. That's right.
The community has to be serious about everybody, not just a few people.
Right.
To make sure that everybody. They tell me we've run out of time.
Oh, dear.
Mr. Dobbins, and I'm going to just call this part 1.
Thank you.
And they have you to come back for part 2.
Okay. I'd love to do that.
Even though you have given us some excellent ideas in terms of how we can make use of the stadium project to deal with the problems in this specific area, I think you did mention earlier that actually these concepts and principles can apply to other governments and other agencies and other sections of this city.
And even Georgia Tech.
And even Georgia Tech. I want to talk to you about that too,
Yeah.
because you're working on the same kind of connectivity project in that area. And by the way, Georgia Tech is a part of the Mighty Five. So we are happy to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Genius of Atlanta has been the great universities that we have, and certainly Georgia Tech is one. And I'm really excited about the work that these graduate students have done in this particular area, and you should be extremely proud of them. I'll be back in a moment with closing thoughts. Stay with us. It is clear from the evidence that a sustainable community must be economically strong. It is also clear that to maintain Fulton County's present economic strength and vitality, it will be necessary that we continue to seek new and innovative ways to identify, develop, and apply all of our resources, including our considerable human capital, to the important work that lies ahead. We are delighted that such an approach has been developed by graduate students at Georgia Tech, and that is now under review by governments in this area. That's all the time we have for today's conversation. Until next time, stay strong. To learn more about today's conversation, contact me at 404-612-8222. That's 404-612-8222. You can also email me at emma.darnell@fultoncountyga.gov. Visit us online at emmadarnell.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.